English Department, the Walker Percy Center, and Loyola University. I would like to welcome all of you here to the panel for Walker, Women, Writers, and Walker. We decided not to put the Percy on the end because we figured all of you would know who he was, and also because it wasn't all that alliterative if we did that. I'd like to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. First of all, Sheila Bosworth's first novel, Almost Innocent, uses, according to Walker Percy, a device that Henry James found very effective. The device of innocence to reveal evil, and as Henry James did in The Turn of the Screw. Guy Gallo said of her novel, Almost Innocent, of her novel, Slow Poison, her wit pierces, yet manages a gentility. She first heard of Walker Percy when she was in the 5th grade at Sacred Heart School, when Mary Pratt, Walker Percy's daughter, was there and kept saying things like, "My father says this, my father says this." And one day the teacher said, "What does your father do for a living?" And Mary Pratt said, "My father's a philosopher." So, next I'd like to introduce Valerie Martin. Valerie Martin is the author of 9 novels, a biography, and 3 collections of short stories. She won the Orange Prize for her novel Property, and she has been awarded the Louisiana Writers Award for 2010. She also wrote a novel, Mary Riley, and I just personally have to say that I suggested to her that they get Kiefer Sutherland and Donald Sutherland to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Good idea.
And so, but she said, "Oh, but they aren't big enough stars," and so they got John Malkovich. But I think that the Sutherlands would have been a better choice.
I would have preferred. I had nothing to do with the final.
I know you didn't. Okay, but it takes Dr. Jekyll, the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, through the eyes of the servant girl Mary. I find Trespass, her penultimate novel, or I say her second most recent novel, because we're sure it's not your last, next to last, her most compelling look at the Bosnian conflict that I have ever read.
Oh, thank you.
Christine, or Chris Wiltz, has written 3 Neil Rafferty novels, of which my favorite is Emerald Lizard.
Thanks, mine too.
Is that your favorite as well? A novel about a New Orleans murder called Glass House, and The Last Madam, Life in the New Orleans Underworld, the life of Norma Wallace. She also wrote an extremely short but compelling picture of the day after Katrina, when she and her husband stayed through Katrina and tried to get the cat to come indoors, but it wouldn't. And so but when they had to leave, she saw somebody boarding up his house again, and he said, "I thought we were done with this. I thought it was over." And then, of course, we all know it wasn't over for several more months. So I'd like all of you to greet our panelists, and I will start with a question, and I'll go over this, so we'll get in anybody's way. I'll start with a question for all 3 panelists, and I would like to call on the audience to ask questions as well. Walker Percy worked at Loyola, taught young writers, many of them taught you, Valerie. What would you say in terms of Walker Percy and your own experience as a writer was the most important or most valuable lesson you learned from either him personally or from reading his works?
The lesson? The lesson that I learned?
Yeah.
Gee, that's a hard one. Even though he was my teacher.
Pardon?
I said, even though he was my teacher.
Yeah.
I guess it was a phone call he made to me while I was working on my 2nd book, and he said, I mean, I don't know, I don't get this guy. Is he kind of a wimpy guy? So I think that was a very good lesson.
He said that about your character.
Yeah, he said that about my character.
Say it again.
He said, he called, he had read some pages of my second novel, and he said, this guy is Claude, I don't know. I think he's kind of a wimpy guy. And that was a very good piece of advice.
Is that on? It's not on. Is it not on?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, so just put your mouth real close.
This close?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow, that does work.
So I went back to work on my character because if it's one thing you don't want your character to be, ever, it's a wimpy guy.
Well, Walker was kind enough to read Almost Innocent, and I remember his saying to me that he thought it would be a nice little novel of manners about the Southern way of life, and then about halfway through, there was a slight demonic clang that he heard in the reading, and I remembered later reading that his biographer, Jay Tolson, said that Walker and his real career began when he gave voice to the demons that were at war within him. In his search for an integrated self and for knowledge of his own soul. So if I had any advice to give to writers and to myself, it would be to go for that demonic clang. Sooner or later, the dark side is what gives it the dramatic tension that even a comedy requires.
Clang?
Clang.
I actually have a letter here that he wrote me at one point, but I'll save that for just a little while. The thing that I felt I learned most from him, and he was never a teacher for me, except in a general sense, but I was at the time writing detective fiction, and the whole thing about detective fiction was local color. You know, they wanted publishers wanted it to be about a place, and the more colorful it could be, well, then the better that was supposed to be. Only what seemed to me to start happening was, especially with New Orleans, the local color was really getting out of hand, and it was painting a picture of the city that, yes, was sort of true, but then in another way didn't nearly catch the incredible depth and contradiction of the city. And Walker made a remark one day, I think at a lunch that we were all at, which later, or maybe previously, was also in one of his books. He said, local color can decay to the merely bizarre. And I think that thinking about that made me try to get a better grip on local color and what it could do, both good and bad.
Well, can you hear me? Okay, that's because I'm always shouting at my students, I think. The one thing that always interested me about Walker Percy is the kind of confluence of philosophy and art. And I wonder if you feel that, in your writings, if you feel that you also have a touch of the philosopher in you, and in what books do you feel, if you do, what books do you feel that it's the strongest?
Yeah, I'll start with that.
Okay.
I like that. I have a touch of philosophy in me. It's called my daughter. She's an ethics professor at University of Pennsylvania, I'm very happy to say. And she always says of my books, your novels are how you do philosophy. And it's true that I do entertain novels as philosophical propositions. And I'm usually trying to work out some sort of question, especially moral questions, as well as tell a good story, entertain people. I feel like novel, and Walker did that as well, and he certainly was interested in philosophy. I think it is a way to do philosophy. It's a way of thinking in terms of character and plot about issues that are entirely, sometimes almost intellectual, but largely moral.
I started out in journalism, and I always think of my novels as being much more journalistic, only in the sense of I'm more the observer than, say, the philosopher. I think if there is any philosophy that comes out of them, it's accidental, so that would make me an accidental philosopher. Yeah, I just don't think that way when I'm putting one of them together, like I'm trying to address some large question. It's more a matter of character and place.
Well, I think the answer to that question might be where, as an individual writer, you begin your work. Some people begin from character. In my books, I usually begin with an incident that I've heard from life and that won't leave me alone. And that is how you know it's yours. If you have an incident in your life that you keep thinking of over and over, you can use that as a jumping off point for fiction, that you can disguise it and embellish it, then you've got a novel that's driven by incident as well as character. I'm like Chris, I think that what happens in the aftermath when you look back, you see the philosophy that has occurred because of the use of incident and character. I unlike Walker, who I think was doing it in a very conscious way after he was recovering from tuberculosis, he spent 4 years reading Beckett and Dostoevsky and Camus and Sartre and Heidegger, and he translated all that philosophy into his novels. And I think he was deliberately doing that, but that was not what I was intending to do with fiction. I think whatever philosophy is in it is there by happenstance.
I want to go on with that, because I think there is a sort of generalization about what the novel does, and the question that it answers ultimately is, how should I live? Mm-hmm. And I think every writer in some way is asking that question in the course of writing a novel. How should I live? How should one live? And that's a philosophical question.
Right. Well, I never thought of that, but that's good. Now, can I say I'm a philosopher now?
Yes.
Okay.
Go for it.
I'm a philosopher. It's no longer accidental.
The problem of evil and the problem of redemption that Percy integrates into all of his fiction might be said to be Catholic with a capital C, but how about Catholic with a small c in terms of how you consider the problems of redemption?
Be first.
Okay, how do I consider the problem?
In your fiction.
I'm thinking of a scene in Almost Innocent, which Walker described to me as a scene of intense evil. And I didn't see it until after the book was finished that it was so very evil, because it was a child whose innocence was being taken away by something that she saw. So in that sense, it's what Valerie just said about how do we live, how do we cope with evil, how do we cope with the evil of others, and how do we cope with the temptation to do evil. I think that perhaps the book that most closely involved evil as far as Walker's work is concerned would be Lancelot, which was my favorite of his novels. And he said to me once, "I can't believe that's your favorite. No one likes that novel. Why is that your favorite?" And I said, "Because it's a love story." And he thought that was highly amusing. He avoided love stories except in Love Among the Ruins. But that book is full of evil, and yet it's full of love too, desperate love. So.
We were just talking about redemption while we were eating. We were talking about those S&H green stamps where you used to go, and they called, the big sign said Redemption Center, S&H green. And there was a church not too far from the one we went to, which was called Christ the Redeemer. And I always had a picture of Christ going to get the stamps, licking a lot of stamps. Yeah, redemption is a word that it has many meanings. I've lost track of the question. What?
Redemption, the problem of redemption, evil and redemption.
The problem of evil is, it's sort of it's another thing we were talking about, racism. It's not something you can address as if it was something that you're going to find an answer to. And it really is a case-by-case study, which explains why writers so often write about really horrific crimes. They're very attracted, drawn to crime, because each one is a particular kind and a particular revelation of what we call evil, but the word is somewhat meaningless as far as I can tell. And I think that when you have general topics like racism, the only way to address it is not to assume that there's some right thing we can do as I just said before. Some right thing we could all do, or wrong thing that we can all do, but that we have to always do it every day, one day at a time. That's the only way to have some sense of what it actually is.
So redemption is always ongoing and possibly always in the future?
Well, that's the hard C Catholic view,
Yeah.
which was certainly Walker's view. It's never ending.
Well, just before I forget to say this, Walker one time, I was also very fond of Lancelot, and one time he referred to it as his pot boiler, which for some reason made me laugh so hard I almost fell on the ground. But, and you know, and he was perfectly serious about it. And okay, it can be a pot boiler, but it's just a really great pot boiler if that's what it was. But it's funny because Sheila wrote Almost Innocent, and in that book, which, you know, she's writing so to that point, and with such incredible, great effect, by the way, one of my still all-time favorites. In my first novel, my first detective novel, I was also writing about a loss of innocence. And I think that in that book, more so maybe than where you're going after the idea of that, and maybe redemption is a little bit more on your mind. Again, accidental redemption, I wasn't thinking about that, but when I got to the end of it, it was only then that I saw that even though no one in the book was hugely evil, evil had been done, and had been done to this child, who is now grown up and supposedly responsible for her actions. Only how do you say somebody's responsible for actions when something has been done to them on that order? And I think that's what I think of as a more small C Catholic redemption, perhaps, although it certainly feeds over into the larger one with ease. But when you get down to it, it's almost like almost every book, when you look back, most of the books you read, certainly the ones I write, I mean, I always see that redemption is a huge factor of what's going on. It makes for a great end, is what it really amounts to.
Yeah, I think Americans are very fond of redemption, the idea of redemption
Definitely.
in general, as opposed to Europeans. I don't see it so much in European literature. I don't know why we think we all have to be redeemed, but I do think it's connected to something you said, that there's a psychological view of character that dominates American literature, and the notion is that if something has been done to you, you are somehow therefore not responsible for what you do, or that it somehow explains what you do. And I find in the European novels that I love, some I don't like, that seems a lot less important. I'm more interested in notions of free will, that you actually make your life, rather than have your life made by the fact that you had bad parents.
And I think that's a Catholic view with a capital C, you know.
Which one?
That you are responsible for your own life. The age of reason in the Catholic Church is 7 years old. Maybe that was decided when everybody lived to be 24, but that's awfully young to be responsible for the choices that you make for good or evil, and that's the Catholic with a C viewpoint.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'd like to have the audience ask some questions. If Walker Percy were writing today, what do you think would be the subjects he would choose to try to encapsulate the kinds of philosophy and moral universe that he's trying to create?
Wow.
Well, I
They're
think
hard questions.
he might not have been able to resist doing something with 9/11, for
Yeah.
instance. I've often wondered and wished that he had been around to give his take on 9/11, because he would have been possibly more horrified than anyone that I can think of, you know. He used to say sometimes in Covington, there was a very poor neighborhood in Covington, and he would say, what would we do if the people in Covington who were in that poor neighborhood suddenly jumped in trucks and came and just shot us all to death in our beds? And his wife would say, Walker, stop it. But I think he would look at the question of what happened to 9/11 from the viewpoint of perhaps the bombers on 9/11, the suicide bombers, the pilots, and try to look at it in a rounded philosophical way. What went into this decision? How responsible for they? Was this for this? Were they? Was it pure, unadulterated evil? Was it capable of redemption? Were any of these people capable of redemption? I would love to have heard his writing on that.
Yeah, I have no idea what he would have done. I think the last work he did, and certainly some of the pronouncements he made, he was becoming more and more of a hardline Catholic and sometimes sort of mouthed the views of the church. In one case, particularly personally to me, he refused to give a quote for a book because he said he thought it would offend Holy Mother Church. And that was, that was when I saw the writing on the wall that he really had made that. He'd made that move from philosophy to a perception of the world through a very strict religious view. So I think 9/11 would have shook him to his feet. And I just can't imagine how he would respond to it. I think it would have been, he'd have to do a whole overhaul, as everybody did.
And it was done in the name of religion.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I suppose that his writings would have gone more in the religious vein, and you know, here we all are sitting in this room, and Katrina has been compared to 9/11 in some ways, in terms of devastation, and also I was talking to Susan Larson a couple of weeks ago, and she had read something about critics being, or I don't know whether it was critics or the New York Review of Books or what it was that you had read, but that the response by writers to Katrina had not been nearly as good, plentiful, or anything else as the response to 9/11 had been, which, to Susan's great credit, I will say, more or less outraged her. And partly that was because, first of all, 9/11 was longer ago. Secondly, we all know that there's a lot of writing going on here about Katrina, but whether or not it can get published is a whole other question. And I think Katrina, 9/11 is much easier to think about in some ways, and especially in the notion of good and evil, or you know, done in the name of religion and that kind of stuff. I would love to see, though, what Walker would have done with Katrina.
Yeah.
I would really like to have seen how he would have approached it, because I don't think he would have come at it from the same view that so many have come at. I just have this feeling that it would have been this very unique, like made everybody sit up and go, oh. Anyway, wouldn't it be something if he could be here and write about something that had happened to us? Anyway.
I think in a way he did write that book, Love Among the Ruins.
You know, I was just thinking.
It predicts this.
It does.
It was a prophetic book.
Questions? Yes.
Just to revisit the Walker Percy quote about local color. Was it that he said local color can decay to the nearly bizarre or to the merely bizarre?
Merely.
Merely?
Merely
Thank you, I like
bizarre.
that.
I'm sorry. Yes, that makes a big difference.
It does.
I think he had certainly, in the course of his writings, which are so, in fact, full of local color to me, but he had begun to see the pitfalls of that local color also. Maybe this is an excellent time for me to read this letter that he wrote, which has something to do with that. And Rhoda, if I stumble, Walker's writing was so bad. You know, not a physician in the world, well, he was a physician, but, you know, it was a physician's handwriting. But I don't think there's one in the world who could have done worse, but here it is. This was written on January 17th, 1987. Well, Joe, and I guess he means my husband, although I have no recollection of this conversation, Joe is quite right. The New Orleans ambiance, I don't know whether it is malaise or what, is so elusive that it is indeed hard to nail down. You might be the one to do it and to get hold of it, and the feel of a Camelback on Magazine or a white brick house on Mockingbird Lane in Lake Vista. Okay, so I read you. I didn't know how sure you were about going for the genre. The Killing Circle is fine, but I didn't know whether this was a stepping stone to ordinary, quote, literary, unquote, novels, or whether you were going to stretch with it. Lucy McDermott and company are done in high style, but if you're really going to do it Chandler style, you've got to get the peculiar smell of New Orleans and saturate the scene like Chandler did with the stink of Los Angeles. Not actually the smell, but the feel. I could not begin to do it. That is just a ridiculous statement. I could not begin to do it, but you might. And with number 2 and 3 on the way, so are you. Yes, it would be fun to talk more about this. Let's speak to our mutual social agent, Rhoda, meaning Rhoda Faust. It was on his mind, and I do remember having a great conversation with him about it. And we never ended up continuing that conversation, but good grief, I would have to argue with him right down to the wire on his ability to catch local color. Love it in ruins. Just think of that. I mean, that was outstanding.
No, he was very good. Gentilly.
Gentilly in the
Nobody did
Moviegoer.
Gentilly.
Nobody did Gentilly. Nobody would have thought Gentilly had any local color until you read the Moviegoer, and then you went,
Yeah.
oh wow. So anyway,
That was really good.
that is one of my favorite statements that he ever made, because local color is much more complex when you start to write than anybody ever is going to give. You just wouldn't think, oh, local color, we got to have it, but you don't realize how complex a subject it is until you're talking to somebody who is a philosopher like Walker Percy, and then suddenly it becomes decaying to the merely bizarre. I love it. Love it.
At the dedication of the library next door, Shelby Foote remarked on Walker, and half jokingly said that the greatest mistake of Walker's life was embracing Catholicism. And I wonder if you have any ideas what kind of writer Walker would have been without Catholicism.
Well, I do remember his saying that the 4 important things that had happened in his life were the death of his parents, his marriage to Mary Bernice Townsend, his conversion to Catholicism, and his becoming ill with tuberculosis, which allowed him to read. I think he converted in 1947, and he got sick in 1941, something like that. So I think that he would not have been, I think Catholicism is what prompted him to write in the novel form. He was perhaps writing essays all his life, but the fact that he could use his Catholic faith as a jumping off point to translate his philosophical ideas into fiction and into something that would perhaps appeal to a larger audience. Without the Catholicism, I don't think it would have worked. He once said to me, "You are Catholic to the bottom of your bones," because I was a cradle Catholic. And he said, "It's the very air that you breathe." We used to argue about it because he said to me, "You seem to have a chip on your shoulder about Catholicism. What is it? What is the philosophy that you object to?" And I said, "How about if it's fun, run?" You know, and he kind of took that amiss, you know, but we used to argue about that and how he thought all nuns were like Loretta Young, and I didn't quite think that. But I don't think he would have been the same writer. It would have been a completely different animal without Catholicism. That's just my opinion.
What do you think?
He's so caught up in the Catholicism that it's hard to imagine, would he have written at all without Catholicism? And
Yeah, his interest in it was unlike someone raised in the church. I mean, I wasn't raised a Catholic, but I went to Catholic high schools. Is this doing anything?
Yeah.
Yeah.
hold it
I went to
close.
Catholic high schools. My family was Catholic, and the whole spooky saints, statues of saints weeping blood, and, you know, lighting candles. I still light candles. You know, all that was a side of it that he really had almost nothing to do with. I think he was interested in a kind of intellectual and dogmatic framework with which to view both his life and the novel. And it can, you know, Flannery O'Connor is a good example of someone who found a way to make her orthodoxy open the world of her stories. But it can have, I think, the effect of closing things down and making the view narrower. In his case, I'm not sure that it really did. But he didn't have much interest in the fun part.
I wonder if he had kept writing. I mean, it did seem like his view was narrowing at the point, you know, that he died. But I'm wondering if he had lived to be older with the kind of mind that he had, that great and inquiring mind, if he wouldn't have eventually opened up more rather than narrowed.
Good question.
You know, I don't know, something in me thinks that maybe he would have, and that he would have started asking some big questions about it.
Well, I also remember his saying that the four most important words in the Moviegoer happened toward the end of the book when Binks's half-brother Lonnie is dying. He's 14 years old, he's dying, and another child says to Binks, at the Last Judgment, will Lonnie still be in a wheelchair, or will he be like me? And the four words that were the purpose of that book, and Walker's own thoughts were, he'll be like you. In other words, this was the end-all, the resurrection of the body and life everlasting was the reason for writing that book.
Wow.
And those were his, and that's about as narrow focus as it gets,
really
even though it
is.
was his first novel.
Yeah.
Any, somebody else?
I have y'all's thoughts. I just started rereading Walker Percy, and I read a lot of it, and then just finished the Moviegoer. And I like y'all's comments. I guess the answer is that he was a very artistic, receptive male, but his renditions of the female and his appreciation of the female, because in the Moviegoer, Binks with his then Secretary Sharon going to the Gulf Coast. He's in his MG and he describes he'd gotten a coat. And he said a little drop of coke spilled on her thigh. And he spends several wonderful sentences describing the paginations of this amber drop going down inside of her thigh. I mean, it's a wonderful bit of writing. Where did this incredible appreciation of female come from?
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned her thigh. Because I've noticed in Walker's treatment of women, and Walker has said, women are just better than we are. I heard him say that. But in Walker's ideal woman, she's not only better than a male, she's also stronger physically than a male. Because if you notice the females that he writes about someone, I think it's Kate, being as frail as a 10-year-old, but with a marvelous heft of buttocks and a wonderful swell of calf and an Amazon-like arm. And I once asked him, why do you write about these great big women? What is it that appeals to you? And he was completely stunned, and he had a face that showed everything that he was thinking, I think. And he was stunned. He said, it's completely unconscious. And I said, well, it's consistent. So you see, you picked that up about I remember that, Sharon's wonderful big thigh with the, yeah.
I wonder if the fact that he was so ill at one time and he was being nursed most likely by women, I mean, that's how he met Bunt, right?
She was a nurse.
She was a nurse. Maybe they just seemed so strong because he was so weak at that moment.
And
and it was all so physical.
His mother died when he was 16. So.
Right. I love the idea though that he was completely flummoxed
stunned.
that you
And I have to say, I was pretty insulted not having a marvelous swell of calf.
Very good calves.
Fine, just not huge.
Since we're imagining the Walker Percy that might have been, I will confess that my durable fantasy is Walker Percy and Oprah. I mean, just imagine.
I think you would have liked that.
Valerie, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that class, which has so fascinated so many of us.
Yes, his teaching at Loyola, I believe, was constituted and comprised entirely of one class. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And he never taught again. I'll tell you about the class.
What was the name of the
Yes,
class?
tell us about the class.
What was the name of the class?
I don't know what it was called, Walker Percy's creative writing class. He had to audition to get into it.
Yeah.
It was advertised in the newspaper, I believe.
What was the audition process?
You sent a manuscript. I mean, you,
Oh,
didn't, you didn't have to.
You didn't have to
No
go
song and dance. You had to send a manuscript. It had great people in it. Tim Gotro was in it. Larry.
Brown?
I can't think of Larry's last name. They're both at Hammond now. Larry had married my former high school math teacher, who was a nun. That was
Goodness.
I'm sure that must have shaken Walker up. And the guy who ran Time Magazine for Walter Isaacson was in the class. I was in the class. Kathleen Reich, I think. Anyway, there were 12. There were 12 altogether. And it started off with everyone, very anxious. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. I think he was a wonderful writer, but he was not a gifted teacher. And the class was pretty quiet, and then it was decided to introduce alcohol. My memory of it is after that, it was just wild. You just never know what would happen. But Walker always had a very large box of raisins, and he ate raisins all through the class.
Raisins and alcohol.
Yeah, when we got to the wine, he was wine and raisins. There were some great manuscripts going on there. Tim was writing something wonderful. Larry, I can't think of his name, was writing a book that was sort of a new Walden. And the classes met, I think, for about 2.5 hours in a little room. And it just went on for a while, and then it was over, and he never taught again.
What year did you say?
I don't know what year.
I think it was 68 or 9. I think it was
Really?
68.
I didn't know it was that early.
Well, I had finished Set in Motion, so I think Adrian had, she wasn't born yet. Yeah, it must have been 68, 9, or 70,
It
maybe.
was in the early 70s.
Well, I think I wasn't here in town. That's the only reason I'm saying it, because I knew nothing about it.
It might have been even as late as 70, 71 or so.
Can I ask Susan a question? Did you say Walker Percy and Oprah or on
That's just
Oprah?
my sick fantasy, that you
And-
have them on television.
Okay.
That's just,
On and on.
I can discuss it at length.
Thank you. Another question? I'm sorry if I'm kind of ignoring you back there. Yes?
You talked about a little about sort of Walker Percy's influence on your writing, but how has reading him sort of affected your reading style? Because I know that that's sort of something kind of interesting.
Well, the thing that nobody that's a writer can forgive Walker for is that he makes it look easy. And he really does. It's like going to a beautiful dinner party and the hostess comes out and says, "Oh, hello, are you here? I'm so glad," and everything's perfectly. That means that the organization and the thought that went into it, as we all know, is phenomenal. But he's a dangerous writer to read in that he makes it look easy, for one thing. And second, I have an odd feeling every time I reread Walker that I'm reading it for the first time, and I've never had that happen with any other writer. I don't know what that is. Is it a lack in me? Is it an incredible gift in him? But has anybody else had that? You've had that?
Definitely.
It's-
3 times.
Yeah, and especially with the Moviegoer. I find that to be the most consistently surprising and repeatedly surprising of his novels, and I don't think you can learn to do that. You can learn what not to do. I think that when you're reading in order to learn how to write, it's almost a negative experience in that you learn what not to do. You notice that he doesn't do this, or he doesn't do that, or he doesn't go on too long, because this line will weaken the line above it. He always knows when to get off stage. He gets off stage right after he makes the decision to marry Kate and to study medicine in the Moviegoer. It's almost abrupt, because he wants to get off before he commits the sin of moralizing. So there's a lesson there. Don't moralize.
Yeah, I think that is one of the big the big lessons, and that smooth surface that you described, and a kind of thoughtfulness in the line-by-line prose that's, it's as if he's thinking out loud.
As if nothing,
Yeah, I like
And that thing, that ability, as if it's just nothing, he's just sort of tossing all this off in such an easy manner, I think it makes that particular one of his books one that so many young writers want to imitate. You know, so you just read it and read it with this, how can I do this? How can I make...
It looks easy.
Yeah, it looks so easy. And I can do this. It looks really easy. And then you sit down to try to do it, and you realize, wait a minute, this is not easy at all. I think another book that's sort of like that, I'm going to do something terrible to Michael over here. Michael Ondaatje is with us today. In The English Patient, when you wrote that, it's not that it looks that easy, it doesn't, but it's that kind of idea of flashbacks are always looked at so badly. Well, don't do flashbacks. Yet you read The English Patient and you think, look how easily he did it. And I can do that. Only when I try to do that, it completely disrupts the entire flow of the book. I think whenever you read a book like The Moviegoer, like The English Patient, something that is so compelling, number one, then something that the author has such incredible authority to make it look that easy, it does affect you, and it affects you. It affects the way you're reading because you're trying to figure out what they're doing, and then it affects the way you write, and maybe that's one of the learning processes.
All
is to
writing turns into a
imitate.
math problem eventually, doesn't it? Can't put that in here. 'Cause
I think
it'll
that's
make this collapse.
a great thing.
structure.
I wanted, Sheila said that it's so surprising to me that, having read The Moviegoer, that he would say that the whole reason that he wrote the book was for those 4 words in that scene with Lonnie, which in a lot of ways seems a little dropped in, you know, given the arc of the whole book. So I'm quite surprised. So I want to know what you two think about that statement, that one would actually say that his book, you know, that there was this purpose in the book, it was direct, moral, and statement. I've just been reading Eudora Welty's essay, What Must a Novelist Crusade, about how one should never do what Walker claimed he did. So I was wondering what you all thought about his having said that statement, that that's what he read it for.
He did it very sneakily, though.
Yeah, but do you see what I'm asking is, how would you respond to that statement if he had told it to you? That that's the reason he wrote the book, so he could say that.
Well, he said the 4 most important words in the book were, he'll be like you.
Yeah, so he wasn't necessarily saying that was the reason he wrote it. I guess what my question to Walker at that point would have been did you know that was going to be the end of the book from the get-go? Did you write the entire book to lead up to those 4 words?
Yeah.
That's what I would have wanted to know.
Yeah, I think that is the right question, because it's possible that they are the 4 most important words to him, because when he wrote them, it was a surprise that he knew the answer.
That's true. Just from a structural point of view, I can tell you that the whole first chapter of my first novel contains in it everything that happened in the last chapter, and I had no idea what was going to happen when I wrote that first chapter. So it's not necessarily that he intended to move to that point. I think that would have made it a rather tiresome book.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
And
it's
it
just,
isn't.
you look back in retrospect and say, this is the reason.
This is part of it too, though, that he started off to be a doctor, he finished his medical studies, and certainly in that book, in Love and Burns, he's a healer. I mean, there are many acts of healing in his work, and to heal that child when he worked to death may be a natural instinct for someone who intended to be a doctor.
That's true.
It's so hard for me sometimes to believe that The Moviegoer will be 50 years old next year. You know, because it's a book that always seems so fresh and new and transformative to people who read it. And I'm curious to know what provokes a rereading of Percy for you. I mean,
What provoked
there are
what?
people- What provokes a rereading? Like, there are people I know who read The Moviegoer every year. There are people I know who get to a point in life where they're contemplating a change or a search, and they read The Moviegoer then. What is it that makes you go back to Walker Percy when you do go back?
Well, let me just say this. First, I never want to read The Moviegoer again. I've gotten to the point where I can no longer take the surprise element of it. I just don't want to do it anymore. I don't know whether it's because I'm all over the place or the things that I'm reading into it are all over the place, but I've done with it as far as I can see. The last time I read it was for a paper that I was writing for a group, and I came to it with 10 years between, and I just don't think I can do it again. It's not a simple book. No.
I haven't reread it.
I'm sorry?
I haven't reread it.
I have reread it. I'm trying to think how many times. I probably read it 3 times. But I'll fully admit that what brought me back to it was I never took a creative writing course in my life, and I felt like it was part of that course. I kept going back to it to see, how do you do this?
Mm-hmm.
How do you pull this off? So that was my motivation, but I actually now think that I would like to be able to go back and read it, not so much as a writer any longer, but just as a
For the pleasure of it.
for the pleasure of it as a person reading, sitting down and reading the book, and go ahead and let it surprise me, because it would be very different than reading it as a writer.
I would like to read it again now because Gentilly is so completely gone.
Gentilly,
And,
yes.
and one of the things I remembered about it was it's just wonderful picture of that little world, which is a part of New Orleans that most people didn't touch. I should reread it.
And that's another thing about him and Katrina, that here was that amazing place that he just changed Gentilly for everybody, and it was so destroyed. Such a terrible thing.
This gentleman and then that gentleman.
I wonder if y'all could help me solve a mystery I just reread a few years ago. Judy and I had bought it shortly after it came out. In rereading it again, somehow in that volume there was a copy of a typewritten letter from Walker Percy. It had all typed over, et cetera, et cetera. It was to be a delivery somewhere. It was very short. But he mentions 4 words that he wishes that he put in. At the end of it, when Biggs and Kate are having a very tender scene where he's telling them in great detail how to catch the street car and go downtown and come back up, et cetera. And he says that he wishes before the last line, if he would have had Kate say, "I'm afraid," and Biggs say, "I know," and then it's the last line. But I don't know where it came from. I can't imagine why I had it.
That's amazing.
Well, that's wonderful that you have it, is what I think.
I'll be glad to see the
Well,
copies.
and you remember that Kate says to Binks at one point, "You're just like me, only worse." And takes one to know one, because Kate was a facet of Walker's psyche. I mean, he did say that the character of Kate, he used that gender trick of disguising the identity of the author. As Dostoevsky is one of each of the 3 brothers Karamazov. There's something of the author in those. There was some of Walker in Kate, and I know that Mrs. Percy has often said that Kate was Walker. So that for him to say to himself, "I'm afraid," and to have the reassurance of the part of him that was sure of redemption, saying, "I know." And then also the "I know." Remember, Kate also says to Binks, "What I want is, I want to fall in love with someone and have him tell me what to do and do it." He wanted a director like a movie has. He wanted a script. He wanted the right to exist, the way actors have a contract to exist within that telescope lit up movie. And that was, I think, why he was so taken with religion. It was a script. It had a director. It was someone that he loved telling him what to do. And to whom he could say, "I'm afraid." And the best part of him would say, "I know, it's all right."
I read the Moviegoer once, and I was an undergraduate at Loyola when I did, so it's been quite a while. But it just struck me while y'all were talking that, from what I do recall of it, it seems to me Katrina was the ultimate validation of what we stated in the Moviegoer. From the main thing I remember, which was not so much about being Catholic, right? It was the idea that in New Orleans, one thing that can cure and blow away the malaise is a hurricane. And I know I experienced that when I was rebuilding Katrina, and it seems to me that one of the most notable things about this whole city was just the way that kind of spirit, not to be corny, but I don't think he's corny in the way he posits that in Moviegoer, the way that spirit can come through, at least with significant enough elements of the indigenous population here, where you just dig in and it's a challenge, and we're going to do this because it's part of the landscape, but somehow we know how to do it. To me, that was the inspirational part, and I just always find it interesting that Katrina seems to validate that. I do think it's an individual initiative with the city. I don't know if the last saying this is Loyola. I don't think it's the Saints. I don't think it was Drew Brees. I think it was that thing that Walker posited in that book.
Good. I'm glad that's what you think.
Well, I was going to ask a question, and maybe he's already answered it, but I wonder, do you feel that the Moviegoer, written 50 years ago, is as relevant today in this city and in this nation, given how it's changed, and given the election we just had, is as relevant today as it was then, when it won the National Book Award?
I certainly do, because I think that's one reason why every time I read it, it seems that I see something else. It's not something that tends to wear out its welcome or to become obsolete. And that's the universality of the genius of the universality of that novel, is that it's set in a certain place and it's set in a certain time, because we're three-dimensional characters here, we're all human beings. It has to be set in a certain place and time, but it transcends all that. And I think it's almost spookily transcendent. When you read it, it's as if it could have been written yesterday. I don't think he overdoes the local color thing. You know, I think he did gentilly because he wanted the so-called ironic distance from the uptown home of Vince Bowling. But I think it is absolutely without time. It's literally a timeless novel.
Yeah, and any novel like that lasts 50 years and obviously affects people's lives as much as it did, transcends politics in any way. It's not tied down by offering facile solutions. It really is. It really has more at stake, both for the characters and the reader, than timely propositions. It transcends all that. And when you read it, you feel that you're in the world of the novel and that the novel of the world is in front of you right now.
I haven't read it for a long time now, and this is really making me want to read it again, but I suspect that it would seem utterly fresh, utterly new, in just about every way. And I think that is definitely part of its genius, if not the bulk of the genius of it, that anything that can live that long and transcend just the ordinary things that books are made of, that's genius.
I guess I'm on the line. I'll ask you another question. I take a class called Reading with the Digital Human. It's an iPad class, and a lot of the students say, if I don't have a book in my hand, I don't feel as if I'm really reading. And I wonder if you as writers have any thoughts or concerns about the fact that we've gone to Kindle, to iPad, to Nook, to Sony, to all of these e-readers. Is that going to make your life more difficult as writers, or is it actually going to help you as a writer to be more universally available?
Go ahead.
I think that the person who said it best most recently is the editor Nan Talese. And she said that with ebooks especially, as she put it, and this is not a new thought, but it's probably new to writers coming up today, you better have another job. you know, or
Yeah, she's
trust
saying that a
fund,
lot lately.
Because the
I love hearing
writers,
that.
the writers used to make, say, let's say $2.40 out of every $20. Now they're making $1.20 with the, you remember Napster and what that did to the music business. So it's never really recovered, and I think that it is very daunting. It's very discouraging, just in a matter of dollars and cents. Like Samuel Johnson said, only an idiot works for no money. You know, so it's gonna come to that, I'm afraid. It seems like a good idea at the time, and it may be, but right now it's tough.
Yeah, I don't think it changes the way I write. I still use a pen and a piece of paper. Most writers, I think, probably still write the same way. It's a question of, do people read in a different way? And your question seemed to imply that reading off of a screen is a different...
No, it wasn't my, it's
The
a
students.
problem with the students.
Yeah, the students are suggesting that the reading off of a screen is different than reading a book. And it is for your eyes, especially if they're old, but, you know, reading words on a page is a process that goes in both the eye and the ear at the same time, and there's nothing else like that. And you hear it and see it. So I don't think reading's going to go away. I think what Sheila says, profits may be affected, but ultimately I kind of think it's all going to be fine. I think publishers are having a crisis because they're not going to, that's another thing Nan says, it's going to go back to being a business run by people who don't make a huge profit and are not looking for a corporate product.
So then we might get better books.
We might get better books. We're certainly going to get fewer books. Everybody's publishing fewer books.
It might be more like the indie movies, you know, that they're the ones that are better. But, well, first of all, I like the way Val said, you know, it goes in your eye a certain way or in your ear. What the thing to me that is so superior about books is that it is your imagination. You watch a movie, that's a whole different thing, but it's not your imagination working. It's somebody else's, and you're watching that. I do find that, for me, there's a huge difference between reading a book on a Kindle and reading one either on a computer or an iPad, and that is because of the backlight. I'm very sensitive to that. The Kindle seems to be more like the actual page of a book. So that's my preference. I do not like the enhancements that are coming with some of the ebooks. I do not want to be reading my novel, or I don't mean mine, anybody's novel, and seeing video footage while I'm reading. Please, spare me. You know, again, that's
really
somebody
bad
else's imagination, and I don't want that intrusion on my imagination. However, my agent has an extremely positive and optimistic view of ebooks, and he believes that writers, in fact, are going to be able to make more money down the line with ebooks because of the volume, and that the ebooks, you know, yes, the publishers will be publishing one kind of thing. There will be the big publishers publishing one kind of thing, all of them looking for the major bucks off that. Then there will be the small publishers who will be, you know, doing the more of the indie thing, and that's where we're going to get some really, really good books. And the ebooks then make all of it available on whatever device they come up with from now till doomsday, and it will, I'm sure, what we're seeing right now will look really
There's one that
paltry.
it plays across the insides of your eyes. Coming
Oh, that's great. It just sounds so terrible.
Yeah, this is how you link the pages.
Michael, do you remember the day that you took Valerie and me through the and I'm sorry that I'm the name of the publisher that you all...
Coach House Press.
Coach House Press.
Still with us.
And the computer was making its big, that was when computers, we were all still writing longhand.
That's the first computer I think I ever saw.
Was in Coach
Yeah,
House?
yeah.
Well, you know, it was all a big thing, and some of the, I think Nan Talese might have been the one that made the statement, I can tell if somebody's written a book on a computer as opposed to longhand. I wonder if that's still true, if she would still think that. But I remember something you said, and it stuck with me, and it has stuck with me for all this time. You said, writing is not about how fast we can do it. It's not about speed. It's about thought. And I thought that that just totally put it in its place. And no matter what they throw at us, both as readers, as writers, just in general, we need to keep that in mind. This is not about how fast we can write a book. This is not about how many books we can read. This is not how fast they can get it to us. This is about our experience with the book and what that writer spent a great deal of time and thought trying to tell us, and how well we absorb that from whatever medium we decide to get it from.
Of course, do you think that there's a difference between field of fiction, whether it's written on an read on an ebook or Kindle, and nonfiction? Because I have heard that people are so information hungry and so rabid for information, and it's available to so many so quickly that fiction is almost beside the point. Do you think that that's a danger?
No, I might have until I had gotten a Kindle to travel with, and was at that point in time mostly reading nonfiction on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the first work of fiction that I read on the Kindle was The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein, which was recommended to me by Susan Larson, and which I downloaded directly on the Kindle because we were going to go somewhere and I was going to save that book to read, and couldn't wait and ended up reading it before we ever left. And if you haven't read it, by the way, read it. It's a great book, and I didn't feel like I missed anything by reading it on the Kindle, and it really made me feel much better about the whole thing, because I was wondering if it was going to feel significantly different reading on the Kindle. If you're absorbed by a book the way I was by The Art of Racing in the Rain, you're not going to miss anything. What I think it does, okay, I'm going to throw this out there. I'm not sure this is true, but it might be. If you're not really caught up in the book, it might make it much easier for you to get bored and ditch it quicker.
Why is that?
Because I don't know.
It's not as tactile. You're not feeling it and touching it and holding
Except
it.
that holding the Kindle is not that bad of an experience, I found. I was not put off by it. But I have found that I'll stick with the printed book longer.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it has something to do with the way your eyes race down a screen. I know that when I read email, I don't do nearly as good a job reading as I do if I have a letter in my hand. I will skip things, and maybe that has something to do with it. But one thing that makes me think is, if that's true, if that, and I don't know, we'd have to have a poll and see how many people have that experience, or if it's just my pathetic experience. But that would mean the writer is going to be called upon more and more and more to really put you in his or her world 1,000% and not let you go. When I started reading Art of Racing in the Rain, which, by the way, is written from a dog's point of view, you know this immediately, and you've got that dog's voice like that, and I'm so into that dog by paragraph 2 that, I mean, I was in that dog's world, and I did not want to come out, ever. I did not want anybody interrupting me. The phone was an unbelievable intrusion. I hadn't been like that for a while, and it was on a Kindle, so I said, take that as a good sign.
Does anybody have any other questions? Because I think we need to begin to wrap this up, so I'll just ask you, I hope it doesn't sound too trite, but there are a lot of young writers in this room, and what advice would you give them?
That's easy.
Read. You know, I remember Walker Percy saying that he gave talks to children at schools and high schools and things, and they would ask him, what's your favorite book of all of your novels? And he would say, I can't stand any of them. That was number one. And then 2, he would say the children would come up to him afterwards and say, I really want to be a writer, but I don't like to read. And he would say, well, then choose another career. But that's the deal. It's like painters who have to look at 5,280 pictures a month before they can begin to know what to do with color and light. Read. And don't waste your time reading, you know, something that's not going to teach you anything about life or your art painlessly.
Yeah, I think for young writers, having patience with yourself is pretty important. I think there's a feeling to give up too soon, a tendency to give up too soon, to get mad at yourself if you're not making progress. One of the hardest things to learn is then when what you're working on is not going to work out and you should go on to the next thing, to let go. So I guess it's just to, don't be so tense, because it should be pleasurable, and it will be if you practice. It's what your mother told you about the piano. Just keep practicing.
Well, Ernest Gaines said it probably as succinctly and well as anybody could. Read, 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 then write, write, write. But I think that what Valerie's saying is incredibly important. Again, you know, I think that young writers want to get to the end real fast. Man, I got to get to the end of this. Again, it's not about speed. It's about thought. And the whole idea, all I know is that writing, for me, has been some of the most pleasurable times of my life, to be sitting there and involved in my world that I'm trying to create, that I hope that somebody else will understand and enjoy as much as in that moment I'm sitting there so relaxed and enjoying it so very much. And I think it's very important to get that enjoyment out of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And,